Now, this beast from the earth is a unique beast. It's unique for several reasons. Number one, because it's a beast that talks. Secondly, because it's the only beast that doesn't fight the previous beast, but rather helps the previous beast recover its power. Another thing that makes it unique is that this is the only beast whose horns are identified. The kind of horns. All of the other beasts, it says that they had horns. But this one says 2 horns like a lamb. They are identified. Which means that this beast is a unique beast. Now, we studied last night that this beast that rises from the earth represents the United States. And I hope that you were able to understand that. We went through the whole history of the United States, upon which 2 principles was the United States built and established. Upon the idea that there are 2 separable kingdoms in one nation. And you know, sometimes when I'm lecturing in the United States, I ask the people, who's a citizen of the United States? Some of the people raise their hands. And I say, oh good, okay, so let me ask you something. You live here in the United States? Yes, I live here in the United States. So you're a citizen of one nation, right? Yes. Okay. So you have a U.S. passport? Yes. So you're a citizen of the United States. But let me ask you, are you a church member? So yeah, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. So I say, how many kingdoms do you belong to? 2 kingdoms in one nation. Are you catching my point? Separated. What God hath not joined together, let us not join together. God has established both. But He has established them for different reasons. The state is to govern in civil affairs, and the church is to govern in religious affairs. You are not to give tithe to Caesar, nor taxes to the church. And sometimes we've come close to crossing that boundary line, that dangerous boundary line of receiving money from the civil power. That will come back to bite us. Because the civil power will say someday, how come if you're not in harmony with union of church and state, why did you receive Caesar's money? The church should sustain itself without aid from the civil power, without aid from the government. And it should be done through the generosity of the church members being faithful in their tithes and offerings. Now, in the United States today, there's a groundswell of evangelicals joining forces with Roman Catholics with the purpose of teaching that in order to be patriotic and Christian, you need to have a government that supports religion, vouchers for you to send, vouchers of public government money for you to send your children to religious schools, prayer in public schools, federal funds for charitable entities, and religious displays on public property. They say if you don't believe in these things, you're not patriotic and you're not Christian. I beg to differ. If you believe that these things, that the government should intermeddle with the church, you're neither patriotic nor Christian. You're not Christian because Jesus said that there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, and you're going against Christ. And you're not patriotic because you're going against what the founders of the nation had in mind. Are you understanding me? So that is a false argument. And the argument that the United States is a Christian nation. No, the United States is a nation composed mostly of Christians. It could never be a Christian nation, because that would be establishing religion, which is forbidden by the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. In fact, the United States has gone clearly on record in the Treaty of Tripoli in 1797 saying that the United States in no way is a Christian nation. Now, does that mean that the United States should be just a secular, atheistic nation? No, it simply means that it's going to govern in civil affairs and it's going to treat all religions equally. And it's not going to meddle in religion. In other words, the civil order, the only thing that the civil order can do is protect everyone's rights to free worship. It cannot establish religion, and it cannot forbid the free exercise of religion. Now let's review the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, where you find the idea of these two kingdoms, which derived from this is the idea of two principles. First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law, because Congress writes the laws, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Not a religion, not a church, not a denomination, religion. In other words, the civil government cannot make laws concerning religion, period. The second clause says, nor forbidding the free exercise thereof. In other words, the government, through the Congress, cannot establish religious observances, and it cannot forbid the right that you have to practice your religion. It cannot tell you how to worship, or it can't tell you that you can't worship the way that you want. And then, of course, the third clause of the First Amendment guarantees civil rights. Interesting that in the First Amendment you have religious and civil rights and separation of church and state. Because the First Amendment continues saying that you have freedom of speech. Is that a civil right? Yes. Freedom of the press. Is that a civil right? Freedom to assemble peaceably. And freedom to request that the government will redress grievances. In other words, do you justice. Are those all civil rights? Yes. So the First Amendment guarantees religious rights and civil rights. And it's based on the idea that there are two kingdoms. The kingdom of the church, which governs itself, and the kingdom of the state, which guarantees the right of everyone to worship God according to the dictates of his or her conscience. Now, I'd like to review two stories from the book of Daniel that we mentioned last night that illustrate the first two clauses of the Constitution of the United States. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States is as close to being as inspired as any human document that has ever been written, because it's based on the concept of Christ, that we're supposed to render to Caesar that which is to Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. And it's illustrated in these two stories in Daniel 3 and Daniel 6. So let's take a closer look at these two stories to see what happens when a government establishes religion, and when a government forbids the free exercise of religion. In Daniel 3, we have the story of King Nebuchadnezzar. Was he the civil ruler? Was he the state, so to speak? Of course he was. He was the civil ruler. What did he do? He raised an image. And he commanded everyone to worship the image. And whoever did not worship the image would be what? Would be deprived of the greatest civil right of all, life. Was Nebuchadnezzar establishing a religious observance? Was the civil ruler establishing a religious observance and commanding everyone to observe that religious observance? Was he going beyond his legitimate bounds? Yes. Could Nebuchadnezzar enforce civil law? Yes, but he could not establish a religious observance and command everyone to worship on pain of death. He was overstepping his bounds and his legitimate sphere of authority. And so there were 3 young men that practiced civil disobedience. They did practice civil disobedience. They disobeyed the king's order. Let me ask you, otherwise, were they exemplary citizens? You can read Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2 and 3, and you'll find that these young men were the perfect example of good citizens, obedient to the civil laws of the kingdom. But when it came to the king establishing religion, they said, we draw the line in the sand. You have overstepped your bounds. We must obey God rather than man. And they disobeyed. And so Nebuchadnezzar called them in. And Ellen White gives some interesting details about Nebuchadnezzar's face and his body language. She says that Nebuchadnezzar called them in, and he said these words: if you don't worship the image, I will throw you into the fiery furnace, and what God will be able to deliver you from my hand? And she says, because she saw Nebuchadnezzar in vision, she says that Nebuchadnezzar said these words with his fist raised to the sky and with the face that looked like the face of a demon, because they had questioned his authority. Now let me ask you, was there any human court of appeal for these 3 young men? There was no human court of appeal. Unless God intervened to deliver them, they were dead. But fortunately, God is the last court of appeal. The Bible tells us that because of their faithfulness, even though they disobeyed the civil order, because the king overstepped his bounds, Jesus himself came into the fiery furnace and delivered his servants from being killed. You see what happens when the first clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States is violated? You find an illustration in this story. The Founding Fathers said that's the reason why the civil order cannot establish religion. Because every time that the civil power has established religion, the result is persecution. Now in Daniel 6 we find a different angle. It's very similar, but it's different. Because in Daniel 6, the king, King Darius, is not establishing a religious observance. He's forbidding the right to pray. Is that forbidding the free exercise of religion? Yes. He's not establishing a religious observance. He's saying you can't worship in this certain way. Now let me ask you, was Daniel an exemplary citizen? Absolutely. In fact, go with me to Daniel chapter 6. And I'll show you something very interesting there. You've probably read it before. Daniel chapter 6. And notice verses 4 and 5. Daniel chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. Even his enemies confessed that he was without fault with regards to civil law. It says in verse 4, so the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Was he an exemplary citizen? So they said, we can't find it in any violation of civil law, so let's try something else. Verse 5. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Wow. Is this an end-time scenario? You better believe it is. They say he's obedient to civil law. We can't find anything where he's been disloyal to the king. The only thing that we're going to be able to accuse him of is the law of his God. And so they influenced the king to give this decree that for 30 days, nobody could pray to any god except him. And what did Daniel do? He opened his windows, and 3 times a day he prayed. Did he disobey the king? Did he disobey the government, the civil order? He did. Did he have a right to? Yes, because Darius had no right to forbid the free exercise of religion. The civil government has nothing to do with establishing religion or forbidding the free exercise of religion. If it does, it's overstepped the reason why God established it. And so the Bible tells us that the enemies of Daniel told the king, and the king was really sorry. He discovered that he had been deceived by these men. But he had already given his word, and the laws of Medes and Persians were unchangeable. And so the Bible tells us that Darius had to throw Daniel into the lion's den. Did Daniel have any human court of appeal? No. So when Darius has him thrown in, he says, may the God whom you serve deliver you because I can't. And the Bible tells us something extraordinary. Daniel fell to the bottom of the lion's den. And all that night, Darius couldn't sleep. He was tormented with the thought that he'd killed this loyal citizen who would have given his life for him. And then early in the morning, without having slept at all, he comes. He says, Daniel! Daniel! Has the God whom you serve been able to deliver you from the mouth of the lions? And he hears a voice that says, yes, O king. The God whom I serve has delivered me from the mouths of the lions. And Darius had him taken out. But now I want you to notice, now the rage of Darius shifts. And this is a theme in prophecy. At the end of our study tonight, we're going to come back to this theme, where those who use the king and deceive the king will suffer the wrath of the king. That is a theme, a central theme in Bible prophecy. And we're going to notice that as we study along. Now, did Nebuchadnezzar and Darius really understand the lesson that God was trying to teach them? They did not understand at all. Because the Bible tells us that after Nebuchadnezzar saw these 3 young men delivered by the Lord, who was in the furnace, he says, I now give a decree. That anyone who says anything against the God of Daniel will be chopped in pieces, and their house will be razed to the ground. Was that legitimate or illegitimate? Illegitimate, because he could not say that people could not speak against the God of Daniel, because that was an issue with God, not with the civil power. And then Darius afterwards says, I now give a decree. By the way, the word decree is used. I now give a decree that all nations must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Illegitimate. Because the civil power cannot tell people that they have to fear and tremble before God. God is the one who can say, you must fear and tremble me. Neither Nebuchadnezzar nor Darius got the point. And I'm looking forward to speaking to them in heaven about it. Because I believe both of them will be in the kingdom. You know, that's one of the great things about going to heaven and living on the new earth, is talking to all of these people. And we'll have an eternity to do it. It's going to be phenomenal. Now let's talk about the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in the end time. Revelation 13:11-18 makes something very clear. And that is that the United States will violate both of the first clauses of the First Amendment to the Constitution. And do you know how they're going to do it? They're going to do it by enforcing the mark of the beast. And Ellen White says that not only will the United States enforce Sunday observance, but they will also forbid Sabbath observance. Now let me ask you, would that be a clear violation of the first two clauses of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States? Absolutely. A clear and flagrant violation. But you know what? That's exactly what the symbol points towards. Because you're saying, now, wait a minute. The United States believes in separation of church and state, and yet now they're persecuting people for not keeping Sunday and for keeping the Sabbath. That's exactly what the prophecy envisions. Because the prophecy says that this beast has two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. Are you following me? So it is a contradictory, just like it's going to contradict the idea of separation of church and state by enforcing Sunday and forbidding Sabbath. In the same way, this beast has two horns like a lamb. It professes to believe in two kingdoms. It professes to be peaceful. It professes to believe in full religious liberty, and yet here it is persecuting. That's the reason why we're told that this beast has two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like what? It speaks like a dragon. Now let me ask you, would a national Sunday law in the United States be a clear violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States? Now, what part of Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, what part of that don't you understand? The last time I knew, no law means no law. Would establishing Sunday as a day of worship be a law? A religious law? Absolutely. A clear establishment of religion. Would forbidding the Sabbath be clearly a violation of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment? Clearly. Any child could tell you that. So how in the world is the United States ever going to proclaim laws that are a violation of its Constitution? In clear violation of its Constitution. Let me explain how it's going to happen. Is the United States going to get rid of the First Amendment? No. Don't think that they're going to rip out the First Amendment and they're going to say, now, that was a good idea for back then, but now what we're going to do is we're going to impose Sunday and forbid people from keeping the Sabbath. That's not going to happen because the beast still has the two horns while it speaks like a dragon. Is it still going to profess to believe in the separation of church and state, and it's going to profess to believe in full religious liberty? Absolutely, but it's going to contradict that because they're going to speak like a dragon. How could that ever happen? Well, let me explain how. The United States, like many other nations, has three branches of government. It has an executive branch, which is the president, and of course helpers. It has the legislative branch, which is Congress, and it has the judicial branch, which is the court system, and primarily the Supreme Court. Now, whenever I lecture on this, I ask the question, which of these three branches of government is the most powerful? Most of the time, I get the answer that it's the executive branch, because the executive branch executes the laws or enforces the laws. But listen, the most powerful branch of government is the judicial branch. Particularly, listen up, particularly the Supreme Court of the United States. Let me explain how it functions. Congress can write a law. Congress can write a law. And if there's a group in the United States that believes that that law is not constitutional, they can appeal it to the court system and ultimately to the Supreme Court. Now, if the Supreme Court says that that law is not constitutional, it will not be law. If the Supreme Court says that that law is constitutional, it will become law. No matter what the majority has to say in the United States, 9 members of the Supreme Court will determine whether a law is constitutional or not. That's scary. If you don't believe that the Supreme Court of the United States is the most powerful entity, all you have to do is look at the 2000 election when Al Gore was running for president against George W. Bush. You remember the problem that they had in Florida? The hanging chads, the cards, you know. They didn't really know who had won the election. And this was a regular circus in the United States. I mean, we'd never seen anything like this. You know, for a couple of weeks anyway, they were deciding what to do. They were taking it to this court, a lower court, and then they would appeal it to the higher court, and then they would go to the other court. But you know what? Eventually, it went to the Supreme Court, and it went on a fast track to the Supreme Court because it was urgent to elect a president. And the Supreme Court of the United States said, George W. Bush is president. There was no more appeal to any court in the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States elected the president. 9 people having the power to elect the president of the United States. Now listen to what I'm going to say. The Supreme Court of the United States has 9 members, 6 of which are Roman Catholics. Even though only 25% of the population of the United States is Roman Catholic. But they have 66% of the justices, or 60% of the justices. Their names are the Chief Justice, John Roberts, is a Roman Catholic. Antonin Scalia, Clarence Thomas, Anthony Kennedy, Samuel Alito, and most recently, Sonia Sotomayor, who is of Puerto Rican descent. 6 of the 9 justices are Roman Catholics. To whom do you think they owe their primary allegiance? To the United States or to the Vatican? To the Vatican. Roman Catholics are taught that their first allegiance is to their church, which is a scary thing. Now, many Protestants in the United States are fascinated by the papacy at the present. And they're fascinated by the papacy because the papacy apparently is fighting for human rights, is fighting for life, is fighting for the poor, is fighting for conventional marriage, is fighting for morality. And the Protestants are fighting for the same thing. And so this has created a bond of union between Protestants and Catholics, their common social causes. And Protestants have been duped into thinking that all of this is genuine and sincere. Now allow me to read you an interesting statement from Ellen White in Great Controversy 571. Speaking about the papacy, she says, it is part of her policy to assume the character which will best accomplish her purpose. But beneath the variable appearance of the chameleon, have you ever seen a chameleon? It changes colors according to its environment. And so she says, but beneath the variable appearance of the chameleon, she conceals the invariable venom of the serpent. One Roman Catholic once said, in the minority we are a lamb. In equality we are a serpent. And in the majority we are a lion. What is the image to the beast? What is an image? It's a likeness, right? Now, if you want to know what the image to the beast is, which is made by this beast from the earth, you have to know who the beast was. Who was the beast? The papacy. So we know that the beast whose image is made is the papacy. Now, an image is a likeness. So the question is, what was this beast like during its period of dominion so that we know what the image is going to be like? What was the central characteristic of the papacy during the 1260 years according to everything that we've studied? That was the end result. Using the power of the state to enforce its religious observances. We saw it in Daniel 2, we saw it in Daniel 7, we saw it in the end time events of Jesus, we saw it in Revelation 13. It's all over the place. That is the central characteristic, which means that making an image of the beast means that the United States of America is going to do the same thing that happened in the Middle Ages. It is going to give the sword of civil power to the papacy. Because that's the way the beast behaved during the 1260 years. Is that clear? Now let me read you from Ellen White. The little old lady understood this, that we're studying from Scripture. Trouble is, we don't believe this much anymore because we become so politically correct that we don't want to offend anybody. It's not my interest to offend anyone. I love Roman Catholics. I just don't love Roman Catholicism. We talked about this. We talked about the system and the difference between the system and the people in the system. We are to love Roman Catholics. But if you love Roman Catholics, you're going to teach them this. Because if you don't teach them this, they're going to be on the wrong side. And they're going to be lost. Do you want them to be lost? If you love them, you will tell them these things in love because you want them to be saved. And by the way, there's not a lot of time left in the history of this world. Now is the time. Because people are saying, no, the time will come when we have to really talk about these things. No, the time is here, now. Great Controversy 443. Ellen White says, in order for the United States to form an image of the beast, the religious power must so control the civil government that the authority of the state will also be employed by the church to accomplish her own ends. Is she right? You better believe she is. In another statement, Great Controversy, page 581, she says this: Rome is aiming to reestablish her power. What does the word reestablish mean? It means that she does not now have it, because she what? She lost it. When? In 1798, when the sword turned against her and the sword was taken out of her hand. She says Rome is aiming to reestablish her power to recover her lost supremacy. No, it's recover. That means that she must have lost it. And then she says how it's going to happen. She says, let the principle once be established in the United States that the church may employ or control the power of the state, that religious observances may be enforced by secular laws. In short, that the authority of church and state is to dominate the conscience, and the triumph of Rome in this country is assured. This beast is going to speak like what? Like a dragon. And what does the dragon represent? Satan speaking through Rome. We saw that not from Ellen White, but from where? The Bible. Now, notice one other statement here on this same point. Great Controversy 445, she says, when the leading churches of the United States, and this is happening now, the churches are all coming together, folks. Political correctness has said, let's not steal members one from another. Let's not proselytize. Let's just all share the gospel together. Of course, the big question is, which gospel? You think the gospel of the Roman Catholic Church is the true gospel? You believe that the gospel of apostate Protestantism is the true gospel? She says, when the leading churches of the United States uniting upon such points of doctrine as are held by them in common shall influence the state. So first of all, you have to join together the churches, right? Shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and to sustain their institutions. Then Protestant America will have formed an image of the Roman hierarchy, and the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. Now you say, how is this going to happen? The Bible says that the whole world will worship the beast. Ellen White says that every country on the globe will be led to follow the example of the United States, including Australia. So much for Article 116. And do you know, you say, how can this happen? It's going to be in the midst of a global crisis. Unparalleled global disasters, economic disasters, natural disasters, increase in crime, where they're going to say there's no way out. We've got to come back to God. We can't be fighting anymore. We have to unite for global survival. But then there's this little group that doesn't want to go along. And you know what they're going to say? They're going to say the reason why things are still going bad is because of this little group. Listen to what she warned in Great Controversy 566. She says, Protestants have tampered with and patronized popery. They have made compromises and concessions which papists themselves are surprised to see and fail to understand. The papists said, this is too good to be true. She continues saying, men are closing their eyes to the real character of Romanism and the dangers to be apprehended from her supremacy. The people need to be aroused to resist the advances of this most dangerous foe to civil and religious liberty. Is she right? You better believe she's right. Now, we still have a few minutes. Now, in the United States, there's a growing intimacy between Protestants and Roman Catholics. And what has drawn them together, like I mentioned, was social issues. Fighting against abortion, fighting against gay marriage, trying to name conservative judges, etc. In fact, documents have been signed between Roman Catholics and Protestants. For example, evangelicals and Catholics together. Some of the most influential Catholic and Protestant leaders in the United States of America signed that document. Basically, the document says, let's just join forces and let's preach the gospel and not try to steal one another's members. Evangelicals and Catholics together. The title itself tells you what it's all about. And then Lutherans signed a document called Joint Declaration on Righteousness by Faith with Roman Catholics. And they said, all these years, we've been thinking that Luther and the Roman Catholic Church were at odds over righteousness by faith. Actually, it was a battle over semantics. We're both right. And they signed this joint declaration on righteousness by faith. More recently, they signed what is known as the Manhattan Declaration. Thousands of religious leaders, not only in the United States, but in the world, signed the Manhattan Declaration, which has the same idea. Let's join forces. Let's not fight over doctrine. Let's just go out and preach the gospel. By the way, I wrote a 2-part article on the Manhattan Declaration that was in our newsletter. Maybe some of you who are receiving our newsletter read that. It's an eye-opening thing. Another example of how Protestants and Catholics are coming together. The Pope visited the United States in April of 2008. And he had a special worship service in St. Joseph's Church in Manhattan, in New York, on Friday, April 18, 2008. I watched this with my own eyes. Present there were 250 leaders from the great mainline Protestant denominations. For example, present there at this worship service where Benedict XVI presided were United Methodists, Evangelical Lutherans, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the National Association of Evangelicals, Presbyterians, the Reformed Church, the National Baptist Convention, various Pentecostal groups, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, and Episcopalian. Even Mormons were represented. But what was even more amazing was seeing Benedict XVI standing on the stage in front, and they had elected 15 of these leaders to come up and greet him. And to see these leaders from these churches go up and not only shake his hand, but actually bow before him. Now, this recorded. Who would have ever thought that such a thing was possible? Very different than when John F. Kennedy became President of the United States. These days, in the United States, there's no fear of Roman Catholicism. In the days of John F. Kennedy, in the early 60s, John F. Kennedy had to go and explain to the ministers in Houston, Texas, what his views of church and state were. Let me read you his views of church and state. This is a speech by John F. Kennedy, so that you can see how things have changed just since the 60s. This address he delivered to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, September 12 of 1960, at the Rice Hotel in Houston, Texas. This is what he said. I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all. A Protestant could have written that. And I believe that had something to do with the assassination of President Kennedy. The United States has become lovey-dovey with the Vatican also on a political level. Beginning with Ronald Reagan teaming up with John Paul II to overthrow the Soviet bloc. Just read the book, The Keys of This Blood, and the other book, His Holiness, by Bernstein and Woodward. Tremendous. On how the government of the United States teamed up with the papacy to overthrow the Soviet bloc. John Paul II receiving the Congressional Medal of Freedom, the highest award that the Congress of the United States can give to an individual. 3 presidents and a president's wife and the Secretary of State of the United States kneeling before the dead body of John Paul II. I'm sure that you saw the pictures. And the Pope visiting the White House and actually giving a speech on the lawn of the White House. Who could have ever believed that such a thing could happen? And yet it's happening. The papacy hasn't changed. The view of people towards the papacy has changed. And political correctness has a lot to do with it. Do you know that history is going to be repeated? And the political leaders of the United States are going to do the same thing that Pontius Pilate did. Do you know why Pontius Pilate delivered Jesus to death?